Hi everyone, I'm here with my colleague Dan Angus from the QUT Digital Media Research Center to present a longer version of our AoIR video about the impact of the Australian news media ban. So let's jump right in. Let me begin first by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we do our work. We acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara people as the First Nations owners of the lands where QUT now stands. We pay respect to their elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits, and recognize that these unceded lands have always been places of teaching, research, and learning. We also want to acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to play within the QUT community, of course. We are talking here about the Australian News Media Bargaining Code, the NMBC, and we probably need to introduce what this code is and does, or at least is trying to do first. We see here from the Australian Communications and Media Authority a brief overview of what the code is trying to do. Essentially, what it is a piece of legislation that is designed to enable news providers to bargain with digital platforms like Google and Facebook for a share of the advertising income that's generated by these platforms as they provide a platform for news by Australian news sites to be posted. This is not uncontroversial, of course, and of course the platforms themselves aren't necessarily fans of this particular piece of legislation, but it's also not controversial because of the way that it has been attempted to be implemented. And we'll see a bit more about that in a moment. Just briefly, here's a timeline. The bargaining code discussion really was started off with the concepts paper by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission in mid-2020, calling for submissions. Then some draft legislation was presented in July 2020 for further discussion. Again, more submissions were called by the end of 2020, and then legislation was introduced into Parliament in February 2021. And here's what happened. First off, as these plans were being mooted, were being discussed by the Australian government, Google, Facebook, and other platforms saw this obviously as something of a threat to their advertising revenue and to the way that they're doing business. So Google, for instance, started to pop up these kinds of notifications saying the way that you use Google is at risk. Your search experience will be hurt by this new regulation. We might be forced to change the way that search operates and remove news from our searches and so on. Facebook was even more explicit and said that assuming this draft code becomes law, we will reluctantly stop allowing publishers and people in Australia from sharing local and international news on Facebook and Instagram, so on the major platforms that they operate. This was in August 2020. That obviously caused something of a stir and caused some debate. The Australian Competition and Consumer Commission that had carriage for developing this legislation essentially said, well, they're probably not going to do this because news is so important on Facebook. They cited research from the University of Canberra saying that nearly 40% of Australians use Facebook for news, nearly 50% use Facebook for news about COVID-19. So clearly news is really important on Facebook, isn't it? And Facebook's not going to go as far as banning news from its platform. Facebook responded in a sense by saying, well, yes, look, lots of people use our platform for news, but in fact, news represents only a small fraction of what people see in their news feed. News is not a significant source of revenue for us. News is actually not that important on the platform. It might be important to the users, and it might be that lots of users are also using Facebook for news, but ultimately they're also using Facebook for a lot of other things. And so, yes, we could still well ban news from Facebook. The Australian government then very helpfully got involved and said, well, this is just all bluffing by these platforms. The Attorney General said, we're not playing poker here. We're not in an environment where we're ever going to be persuaded by heavy-handed predictions or bluffs to change our legislation. We're not going to let ourselves be held hostage by these platforms and be bullied essentially into changing our legislation. So Again, in early February, they actually ended up introducing this legislation into Parliament. Now, problem with all of this is that it wasn't a bluff. So on the 18th of February 2021, Australians woke up to news pages on Facebook that looked like this. This is the page by ABC News, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, our major public broadcaster, and suddenly its Facebook page was empty of posts. Anything that it had posted over the many years that had been on Facebook had disappeared, basically, had become invisible on its page. If people were trying to access posts that contained links to Australian news or any other kind of news on Facebook, this is the sort of notice that they would see. This content isn't available at the moment. That goes even for content that had been posted previously. So no news was accessible for Australian users on Facebook. If you were trying to post links to Australian news sites or any kind of news sites, international as well, on Facebook, this is the notice that you would see. Your post can't be shared. You can't post this link because Facebook is now restricting the posting of news links and all posts from news pages in Australia. Globally, the posting and sharing of news links from Australian publications is restricted. But this didn't just affect news as we normally understand it. News like pages and sources were also affected. So here, for instance, is the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia, which of course posts news-like content in that it pulls weather observations, weather updates, weather warnings, and so on as well that are news to a certain extent. So it too could no longer post, its content disappeared. And perhaps most problematically in the context of a global pandemic, the various health departments, government health departments and so on also could no longer post, and also all of their advice on the pandemic and other matters had disappeared from their pages. So this was essentially a complete wipeout of this kind of content from anything that remotely looked like news to Facebook. Now, for our analysis of the full impact of all of this, I'm going to hand over to Dan.
Thanks, Axel. So what we looked at was data that's provided to us by CrowdTangle, which is the, I guess, the data arm of Facebook that allows us access to a selection of Facebook content. So what we did here was restrict just to Australian-based public Facebook pages. The reason that we weren't going after groups and pages is that CrowdTangle only allows or exposes the location of administrators on Facebook pages. So for this, these are pages where a majority of the page admins are registered as Australian Facebook users. And so within this, what we see here is the tracking of posts and interactions within those posts to Australian Facebook pages. What we see is 3 days prior to Facebook hitting the big red button and implementing this ban, where we see a kind of normal periodicity of the kinds of normal posts and interactions occurring across news content on Australian Facebook pages. I should say that the pages we're talking about, or the linking practices, are to known news sites. So this is a list that comes from Axel's @nix list, which is known news providers, and so ABC and other kinds of commercial media.
In total, that's about 40 news domains, well-known Australian news domains.
Yes, so Murdoch and other kinds of stables in there as well. Now, what we see here is not too uncommon to our own personal experiences of this, waking up to this ban. I know many communications researchers were getting hit by journalists wanting to kind of comment on this. But the first thing that I found myself doing was trying to figure out what's actually allowable, what can we do here? And so what we see here in that kind of decrease in terms of the posts being shared to Facebook is not a zeroing out of posts. There is still a small number, particularly in those first kind of 4/5 days of the ban, where people are getting around the ban in some way and able to post links to these news sites. So, these were through various creative practices people were figuring out, and there was almost a wholesale market in this of how to still post news content. But importantly, at the end of that period, you see that Facebook figures this out. They've figured out kind of a lot of the loopholes that people are using. And so you see a near zeroing out then of posts and links out to these new sites. Most importantly, though, is the interaction. So the bottom line, this yellow or orange line, is that even though that some of these pages or people were able to figure out how to post links, these were not being seen or not able to be interacted with. So, it was, a pretty clear zeroing out of interactions with any kind of news-like content that was being shared on Facebook in Australia. So, remembering back to what Axel was saying, that Facebook made these overtures around that news isn't that important, that makes up a fraction of traffic. They're actually fairly truthful here. What we see here is this red line, which shows the total kind of actions around posting and interactions to any kinds of content, not just news content. And that red line shows that, aside from the weekend there in the middle of this graph, during that period of that news ban, very much traffic and amounts of posts and interactions are largely unchanged. For reference, that kind of teal, that light blue line shows the impact on those specific news content links and the interactions with those, which of course were zeroed out. But yeah, very much, largely the wider platform was unaffected by this. Now, if we drill into some of the top sites, so here we see a listing of the top 25 news sites and the volume of links that they were sharing in that 3 days prior to the ban, during the ban period, and then the 3 days post the ban. And what we see is indeed, some really interesting dynamics in terms of a massive decrease in the amount of posts per day being able to be made by those major news sites. Interestingly, seven.
And sorry, not just by the sites themselves, but by anyone
around. Yeah, that's it.
So it's the sharing of all of those domains across Facebook.
Across Facebook by any users. So within this, what's interesting is that 7 News, people are still trying to figure out how to post this content. We'll come back to this because it's you need to kind of link this up with the interaction data we were talking about. But yes, still people trying to post links to this particular news content. Interestingly, Google is unaffected by this. People were still posting Google links. In fact, people were using that as a way to share links to news content by sharing these Google links where they'd searched and found a Google link to a news story. YouTube as well, unaffected largely by the ban. So very much the same volume of content being shared through links. Bitly is a different story. So yeah, some of the news content was trying to be disguised through Bitly links, but Facebook was resolving those domains and taking a lot of that content down or not allowing it to be posted. So yeah, very much Bitly, a bit of a mixed bag there in terms of the number of links. And yeah, interestingly for us as mis and disinformation researchers, some very problematic kind of, mis and disinformation news sites were unaffected by this, so Epoch Times is one of those, was still able to post links. So I guess Riley, they're clearly not news, right? In terms of then other sites, Links a Day here, interesting things to point out, like, a new launch of what looks like a news site attached to China, a very pro-China news site, maybe not caught up in this because it was caught right at that cusp of launching and so wasn't pre-classified as news by Facebook. And so that's interesting in terms of perhaps news sites reinventing themselves. Had this have gone on for much longer, they may have popped up in different ways through other kinds of subdomains.
Change the domain so they don't get classified. Yes,
that's it. Twitter saw a near doubling of link sharing, another kind of workaround that people developed where they were able to share and package news through the sharing of tweets. Interestingly, not in that data, but I was going to comment that I also saw within that a lot of screenshotting, right? So people, using images to share. Mm-hmm. So remember, we're only looking at links. So this is the URLs that are embedded, and not specifically looking at screenshotting and other activities people engaged in to try and subvert the ban. In terms of the interactions, this is where I think it gets really interesting because, as we're saying, these sites were still, or people were still trying to post links to these sites, but how much were they being seen or interacted with? And in this, looking down this list, it's an almost 100% decrease in interactions across most of these major news sites. The counter to that is interesting, is that satire flourished. And I mean, they made a real song and dance about this. I remember the Batuta Advocate and the Chaser and others saying, well, we're actually the only ones left standing. And that's funny because they've often interacted themselves as sites with the broader kind of establishment news, environment. I remember meeting the Batuta Advocate developers, the content creators, at a Walkley Awards, one of our premier journalism awards, and they kind of see themselves adjacent to news, but clearly as satire. And yeah, they had a field day here with a doubling of interactions to their content and their links. And then also Google as a pathway to news. So a near doubling of Google links out to news content.
Interactions with Google links.
And interactions with those. Bitly again. So as we were saying, the share of links, using Bitly decreased, but then also, yes, they are inaccessible as well. So Facebook doing its work to try and resolve those links and decrease the visibility of those and decrease the interactions. There was an interesting reversal of bans on food media content. And so, we're going to kind of see this again in a sec. A lot of what was kind of left unaffected by this was a lot of that lifestyle food content. And so, this here we see a decrease in interactions, but in that period, initially there was almost a total ban on that content in terms of the number of interactions it could attract, but that was restored later in the period. So kind of being caught up in the mix there, I think, in those numbers. And again, YouTube, similar to Google, as another pathway for people to interact with news content on Facebook. And then looking at the top 25 sites in terms of interactions during the ban itself, reinforcing that news satire really was the winner through this, accounting for most of those the top links there, aside from obviously the news referrals through search and through other providers. So absolutely. I mean, 407% increase for the Chaser as a satire site. So quadrupling the traffic and interactions. And then, more of that idea about the tweets as a pathway to news. So, a massive doubling of tweets and interactions with tweets on the platform. But as grouped here, all these ones in this long tail now are the kind of lifestyle, food and sports. We see major sports codes here, AFL, NRL, those kinds of things present, perhaps taking on more of the role in doing their own media during this time. Interesting, not reflected in our data were the efforts that were happening outside of this, of particularly the news sites, to try and push audiences back onto, say, native apps, onto their websites or other things. So those that were left on Facebook kind of made what they could of the situation to try and drive traffic back to their own pages or their own content, and of course other people sharing to those. So Axel.
All right, so I'll finish by saying a little bit more about the aftermath of all of this. Obviously, the news ban itself was eventually reversed, and Australian news sites were able to post their content again on Facebook, and Australian Facebook users could post links to Australian and international news sites again. There's been some debate about who eventually won. All sides in this debate have variously portrayed themselves as the winners. The government said, well, hey, we showed these platforms who's the boss, and the platforms are now paying some amount of money to Australian news publishers. So Australian news publishers can say that they've won, they've got a bit of extra revenue, but at the same time, the platforms also can say that they've won, because while the bargaining code became law and while platforms are now paying some money to Australian news sites, Google and Facebook particularly have been exempted from being what's called designated under the news media bargaining code, which means that the money that they're paying to Australian news platforms is essentially voluntary. It's not governed and it's not forced by the News Media Bargaining Code itself. They are exempt and they're not going to be covered by any future extensions of that bargaining code at this point. And in fact, if the bargaining code at some point was going to be applied to them, we would probably see a repeat of all of this playing out again. Frankly speaking, overall, I think it can be said that the platforms probably won this round. The government has been able to engage in some face saving by saying, yes, there's money flowing to the news publishers now. But overall, the platforms have got away with not being covered by the code. They are paying what, in the context of their overall revenues, is a pittance to Australian news publishers. There is no requirement for that money, by the way, to be used in any way to support Australian journalism. So it just adds to the bottom line of the news publishers themselves, and they can do with that money whatever they want. So while it's not perhaps entirely clear, while we can argue about who were the winners in all of this, I think it's fair to say that Australian news consumers, and possibly Australian journalism too, did not win from any of this, because ultimately it's a commercial transaction between the platforms and the news publishers that does not necessarily have any material impact on the quality of Australian journalism or the experience of Australian news consumers. So as far as lessons go for other jurisdictions, this may not necessarily be a model that can work elsewhere, that is necessarily worth applying in other contexts. And ultimately, what we have seen more than anything is just the extraordinary power that platforms like Google, but particularly Facebook, wield in this networked news environment. So we'll leave it there. Dan?
Yeah, just one final comment from me is that I guess the most frustrating thing looking at this is that there is an opportunity here to regulate the platforms and regulate them well in some respect, and it's kind of a missed opportunity. And I feel like there's that opportunity cost that's been lost now, that it will probably take several years to build up steam to actually try and attempt regulation of platforms around things like, accountability in their advertising or other kinds of matters that are of significant public importance. And that, one of the losers here are those efforts for building greater transparency and accountability into the platforms. So I guess I see that as another lesson here that, we've missed out, I think, on a golden opportunity to do something of worth and value. And instead, as you say, we now have this largely unused, unutilized piece of legislation, which has not really kind of benefited anything.
Yeah, most certainly. So finishing up, we'd like to thank our funders. We also, of course, thank CrowdTangle as the source of the data, which obviously in this context is slightly ironic because we're working with data from CrowdTangle, a Facebook subsidiary, to understand better how the news media ban that Facebook enacted played out on Facebook. So nonetheless, we thank them very much for the data that we've got access to. And we hope you enjoyed this, and we hope you also enjoyed the rest of the News Media Bargaining Code panel. Thank you.